Winston Churchill was one of the most important leaders of the 20th century. He was born into a rich but troubled family, worked as a soldier and a journalist, and became a famous politician. Churchill faced many defeats in his career, but he never gave up. During World War II, he became Prime Minister of Britain and inspired people with his strong speeches and courage. He helped lead the Allies to victory against Nazi Germany. After the war, he warned the world about the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, which began the Cold War. Churchill was not only a politician, he was also a writer, painter, and historian. He even won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He died in 1965 at the age of 90, and the whole world honored him as a hero. Today, Churchill is remembered as a symbol of determination, leadership, and the power of words. Winston Spencer Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, a large and famous house in Oxfordshire, England. His family was very important. His grandfather, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, came from a long line of aristocrats. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a well-known politician in the Conservative Party. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was American, the daughter of a wealthy New York businessman. Winston grew up in a world of privilege, but his childhood was not easy. His parents were often busy with social events and politics, so young Winston did not receive much personal attention from them. He spent more time with his nanny, Mrs. Everest, whom he loved deeply and later called "my dearest friend." As a boy, Winston was energetic, curious, and sometimes difficult to control. He had a lisp and struggled with school subjects like Latin and mathematics. Teachers often described him as lazy or careless. However, he had a strong memory and loved history, storytelling, and reading about famous battles. He dreamed of adventure and of becoming a hero. At the age of 12, he was sent to Harrow School, one of the top schools in England. Life there was strict and competitive. Churchill was not the best student, but he started to show talent in subjects like English composition, history, and writing. He also became interested in the art of public speaking. Later, he said that learning to speak clearly and powerfully was one of the most important skills of his life. Churchill was not only interested in books, he loved action. At Harrow, he joined the military cadet corps and began to imagine a career in the army. His health, however, was sometimes weak. He suffered from pneumonia as a child, and his parents worried about him. But Winston had great energy and willpower. After several attempts, Churchill was accepted into the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in 1893. He trained to become an officer in the cavalry. This was a big achievement for him because it was not easy to enter Sandhurst. At the academy, he performed surprisingly well, especially in military strategy and leadership. In 1895, at the age of 21, Churchill graduated and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the British Army. This moment was the real start of his adventurous life. He was young, ambitious, and hungry for both fame and success. Churchill wanted more than just a military career. He wanted to write, to speak, and to shape history. When Winston Churchill finished his studies at Sandhurst in 1895, he entered the British Army as a young officer. But Churchill was never satisfied with just being an ordinary soldier. He wanted adventure, excitement, and also fame. He quickly learned that the fastest way to become famous was to write about his experiences. Early military adventures. His first posting was with the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment. But Churchill did not stay quietly in the army. He searched for opportunities to go where the action was. In 1895, before even joining his regiment, he traveled to Cuba as a military observer during the Cuban War of Independence. There, he saw combat for the first time and even came under fire. This trip was important because it gave him a taste of both adventure and journalism. He sent reports back to London newspapers, which began to publish his writings. Soon after, Churchill found himself in India, stationed in Bangalore. Life in India was not only about military drills. Churchill spent his free time reading history, philosophy, and politics. He educated himself far beyond what he had learned at school. He once said, "I read history a great deal. I know nothing about mathematics, but I know a great deal about war." In 1897, Churchill saw real combat on the northwest frontier of India, fighting against local tribes. He wrote detailed reports of the battles, which were later published in his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force. This book made him a recognized writer in Britain. Later, in 1898, he joined the British campaign in Sudan under General Kitchener. Churchill even took part in the famous Battle of Omdurman, one of the last major cavalry charges in history. Again, he turned his experiences into a book, The River War. By now, he was becoming both a soldier and a successful author. The Boer War and National Fame. In 1899, Churchill left the army to focus on politics, but before starting his political career, he accepted a job as a war correspondent for the Morning Post newspaper. He went to South Africa to report on the Second Boer War. This was the event that made him famous. While traveling by train, Churchill was captured by Boer soldiers and taken as a prisoner of war. His situation seemed hopeless, but Churchill managed to escape from captivity. He walked hundreds of miles, hiding during the day and moving at night, until he reached safety. His daring escape was reported in newspapers across Britain, and he returned home as a national hero. Churchill quickly wrote another book, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, about his adventures. His bravery and storytelling made him a household name, and this opened the door to politics. First steps in politics. In 1900, Churchill ran for Parliament as a candidate of the Conservative Party. Thanks to his fame from the Boer War, he was elected as the Member of Parliament for Oldham. At only 26 years old, he had already been a soldier, a war correspondent, an author, and now a politician. However, Churchill's political journey was not simple. He was independent-minded and often disagreed with his party. By 1904, he crossed the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Liberal Party, shocking many people. He believed the Liberals were more progressive and that they supported reforms to improve life for ordinary citizens. As a Liberal politician, Churchill quickly rose through the ranks. He became known for his strong speeches and his ability to debate. He served in several important positions. Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, 1905 to 1908, where he worked on social reforms such as better working conditions, unemployment insurance, and minimum wages. Home Secretary, 1910 to 1911, where he dealt with strikes, prison reforms, and even the famous Siege of Sydney Street, a dramatic gun battle in London. In 1911, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy. This was a crucial position because tensions in Europe were rising and many feared a future war with Germany. Churchill began modernizing the Navy, pushing for new technologies such as oil-powered ships instead of coal. By the time World War I was approaching in 1914, Winston Churchill was one of the most important young politicians in Britain. He had already built a reputation as a man of action, a skilled speaker, and a bold reformer. But soon, the war would test him like never before. When World War I began in 1914, Winston Churchill was already First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. He was only 39 years old, but he had enormous responsibility. Churchill believed strongly that Britain needed a powerful navy to fight Germany, and he pushed hard for modernization and readiness. He was a man of ideas.
When World War II began in September 1939, Winston Churchill was brought back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy. He was 65 years old, full of energy and determined to fight Nazi Germany. For years he had warned about Hitler's threat, and now his warnings were proved correct. Becoming Prime Minister. The first months of the war did not go well for Britain. Germany quickly invaded Poland, then Denmark and Norway. In May 1940, Germany attacked France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, lost the confidence of Parliament because his policy of appeasement had failed. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It was the most dangerous moment in modern British history. France was collapsing, the British Army was trapped at Dunkirk, and many thought Britain would soon be invaded. Churchill, however, never lost his courage. In his first speeches as Prime Minister, he told the nation the truth, that the struggle would be long and hard. But he also gave people hope. In his famous words, he promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He told the British people, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." These speeches lifted the nation's spirit and showed the world that Britain would not give up. Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. In late May 1940, the British Army was trapped in France at the port of Dunkirk. Churchill ordered a desperate evacuation, using not only Navy ships but also civilian boats, fishing boats, yachts, and ferries. Against all odds, more than 300,000 soldiers were rescued and brought back to Britain. This became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Soon after, Hitler prepared to invade Britain. In the summer of 1940, the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, began bombing British cities and airfields in what became the Battle of Britain. Churchill praised the Royal Air Force pilots who defended the skies, calling them the few. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Thanks to their bravery, Germany failed to gain air superiority, and the invasion was stopped. The Blitz and Britain Alone. From 1940 to 1941, German bombers attacked London and many other cities in nightly raids known as the Blitz. Thousands of civilians were killed, and much of London was destroyed. But Churchill refused to leave the capital. He walked through bombed areas, visiting people, showing that her leader was standing with them. His presence inspired hope and unity. For a long time, Britain fought alone against Nazi Germany. Churchill worked tirelessly to gain allies. He built a strong relationship with President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, who began sending weapons and supplies under the Lend-Lease program. Alliance with the United States and the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill, although strongly anti-communist, immediately offered help to Joseph Stalin, saying that any enemy of Hitler was Britain's friend. In December 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States officially entered the war. This was the turning point Churchill had been waiting for. He traveled to America and spoke to Congress, saying that Britain and the U.S. would fight side by side until victory was won. Together, the Allies began to push back. Planning victory. Churchill played a central role in planning the major operations of the war. He attended conferences with Roosevelt and Stalin in places like Tehran and Yalta, where the future of the world was being decided. One of the most important moments came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, France. This invasion, planned with Churchill's involvement, began the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. The end of the war. By early 1945, Allied armies were closing in on Germany. Churchill was celebrated as the great wartime leader who had refused to surrender when Britain stood alone. In May 1945, Germany finally surrendered. Victory in Europe was achieved. On May 8, 1945, Churchill addressed the nation. "This is your victory." He gave credit to the courage of ordinary British people, soldiers, and allies who had made it possible. A surprising defeat. But only a few weeks later, in July 1945, Britain held a general election. To Churchill's shock, his party lost, and the Labour Party won under Clement Attlee. Despite his role in saving Britain, many voters wanted social reforms after the war, not just military leadership. Churchill was no longer Prime Minister. Still, his legacy as the man who led Britain through its darkest hour was secure. After World War II ended in 1945, Winston Churchill was one of the most famous people in the world. He was seen as the man who had saved Britain from Nazi Germany. However, politics can be surprising. In the general election of July 1945, the British people voted for change. They wanted social programs, new jobs, and housing after years of war. Churchill's Conservative Party lost to the Labour Party, and Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Churchill was deeply disappointed, but he did not give up. He became the leader of the opposition in Parliament. In 1946, Churchill traveled to the United States and gave one of his most famous speeches at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. He warned that Europe was being divided by what he called an Iron Curtain, separating the free countries of the West from those controlled by the Soviet Union. This speech is considered the beginning of the Cold War, the long struggle between the West and the Soviet Union. Churchill once again showed his ability to see dangers before others. In 1951, Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister at the age of 72. Even though he was much older, he still worked hard and gave strong speeches. His second government was not as dramatic as the wartime one, but it focused on rebuilding Britain after the war and managing foreign policy during the Cold War. During these years, Churchill also promoted the idea of a united Europe. He believed that European nations should work together to prevent another war. By the mid-1950s, Churchill's health began to decline. He suffered several strokes and was often tired. In 1955, he finally retired as Prime Minister, though he remained a Member of Parliament until 1964. Outside politics, he dedicated himself to writing and painting. He had always loved painting as a hobby, calling it his joyride in a paintbox. More importantly, He worked on his monumental 6-volume history of World War II, which became a worldwide bestseller. In 1953, Churchill received the Nobel Prize in Literature for his historical writings and speeches. The Nobel Committee praised him not only as a statesman, but also as a master of the English language. Churchill spent his last years surrounded by his family at Chartwell and later in London. He was often in poor health, but remained respected as a global symbol of courage and leadership. World leaders continued to visit him, showing their admiration. On January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill died at the age of 90. The date was symbolic, exactly 70 years after the death of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. His funeral was one of the largest in history. Leaders from across the world came to London to honor him. The Queen herself attended, which was rare for a commoner's funeral. Millions of people watched the ceremony on television. Britain and the world said goodbye to the man who had led them through their darkest times. Winston Churchill's life was full of highs and lows, victories and mistakes. He was sometimes criticized for his stubbornness or controversial opinions, but he is remembered above all as a man of courage, determination, and powerful words. He once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." This quote reflects his whole life, a journey of resilience, energy,